Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Marie Johnston, the Education Program Manager here at the American Society of Agronomy, and it is my pleasure to moderate today's webinar. The title today is Best Management Practices for Water-Soluble Fertilizers. We'll be talking about how to use and select these products for maximizing the precision potential of your crop. This will be a slight continuation from last week's topic about fertigation. We'll touch on that a little bit. And hopefully you'll learn something new about these water-soluble fertilized products. As we get started, please reach out to my colleague, Lacey Edwardson, if you need some support. I'll drop her contact information in the chat. Also, this webinar is worth 1 credit in nutrient management. That will be awarded to your account upon completion of the webinar. You will also have access to the recording. You'll get an email about that when that recording is available. And finally, there are a couple webinars planned yet for 2023. In November, we'll reconvene about biochar and organic amendments, and in December, we'll talk about some nanotechnology applications. So stay tuned for those upcoming events. And our speakers today, we have 3 of them. So we have a bit of a panel. They'll bounce back and forth and kind of touch on each other's topics and share their insight as applicable. Christi Falen is the Agronomy Technical Services Manager for ICL. She works across the Pacific Northwest in California. She lives in Idaho, and she brings about 25 years of experience from roles in extension, plant nutrition, and crop production. Christi holds a bachelor's degree in natural resources management from the University of Alaska and a master's in soil science from the University of Idaho. Dr. Jason Haegele is the agronomy lead at ICL. He drives research collaborations for both row crops and specialty crops across North America. He holds a doctorate degree in crop science from the University of Illinois and a master's degree from Iowa State. And David Holden is the owner of Holden Research and Consulting, where he completes field evaluations of nutrient and pest management products for both traditional and organic farming operations. David has worked as a pest control advisor for over 40 years. And he has a specialty experience with California products such as avocado, berry, citrus, vegetables, and wine grapes. David holds a bachelor's degree in agricultural biology with a specialization in economic entomology from California State Polytechnic University in Pomona. And finally, I want to point out that all 3 of our guests today are certified crop advisors. So you may have questions relevant to that too. You can pose your questions at any time, and I will forward them to them during the presentation. So Christi, Jason, and David, welcome, and we are looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you.
Yep, and you should be getting the prompt here to share your slides any second. And there we are. So perfect, they look good.
All right, great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us here this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you're based at. We're going to talk about water-soluble fertilizers. We'll have some examples of water-soluble fertilizer use for fertigation, but also some applications for foliar use as well as starter fertilizers. To many, ICL may be an unfamiliar name. ICL is not a new company, however. ICL has been around for over 100 years now, having started near the Dead Sea in Israel 100 years ago, for the purpose of extracting minerals like potash, magnesium, and bromine from the mineral-rich waters of the Dead Sea. Over time, the businesses of ICL have evolved and expanded to other industries, but especially fertilizers and water-soluble fertilizers, continues to be an area in which ICL demonstrates leadership and innovation in creating very high-quality water-soluble fertilizer formulations, oftentimes for use in fertigated and irrigated cropping systems. So as we get into the talk this morning, we're going to talk about best practices or share some ideas for the use of water-soluble fertilizers, and really address these 3 key questions. And one is, how do we cost-effectively optimize inputs such as water, if we're thinking about an irrigated cropping system, as well as fertilizer without sacrificing yield? And one approach is to adopt precision application practices, thinking about things like drip irrigation as an example, along with the use of water-soluble fertilizers. We'll also address and help to understand the differences between soil applied and foliar fertilizers, and choosing the correct water-soluble fertilizer formulation and application method to balance the nutritional needs of a specific crop. And then finally, we'll discuss characteristics of water-soluble fertilizers and highlight some different use case scenarios for fertigation, drawing from examples of especially crop applications and trials in California, specifically strawberries and bell peppers. Why would we consider using water-soluble fertilizers? The first answer is that water-soluble fertilizers and the wide array of water solubles that we have available to us in the market can be used for different application methods. Starter fertilizers is an example. We'll have one example of that on corn. Fertigation, obviously, and then foliar applications as well. Water-soluble fertilizers and all the different formulations that are available and different analyses, nutrient analyses, allow for precise control of nutrient management. In other words, more customization throughout the growing season, depending on the crop that you're growing and what's needed for the crop and how it's developing and either flowering, fruiting, or developing vegetatively. Third reason might be greater nutrient use efficiency, especially when combined with precision irrigation approaches like drip irrigation. We have the ability to deliver, the water, very close to the root system of the crop, and in that water stream, in turn, deliver nutrients, either water solubles or potentially even liquid fertilizers in some cases, right to the roots of the developing crop. And then finally, optimizing nutrient availability for the crop demand. This leads to increased profitability and reduced nutrient loss potential. If we think about the 4R approach, that type of framework is really around reducing the potential for nutrient loss in the environment, and through adopting these precision ag approaches, drip irrigation is an example, along with the right nutrients at the right time in that very targeted application zone, we can decrease that nutrient loss potential. When we think about choosing water-soluble fertilizers, these are some of the parameters or considerations that we'll touch on throughout this presentation. Particularly in irrigated cropping systems like those of the Western United States, water quality parameters like pH, electrical conductivity, and dissolved bicarbonates have a huge impact on the availability of nutrients to the crop, and also influence which water-soluble fertilizers or nutrient sources we might choose to use. One consideration, particularly as we think about high pH sources of irrigation water or irrigation water that's high in bicarbonates, would be the need for reducing the pH or choosing an acid-forming water-soluble fertilizer versus a non-acid forming water-soluble fertilizer. And Christi will talk more about the influence of water quality and how that affects water-soluble fertilizer choices as we get further into the presentation. Another consideration might be choosing a water-soluble fertilizer formulation with lower salt index or lower chloride content. Particularly as we think about potassium, there are many water-soluble fertilizer formulations that are based on monopotassium phosphate, MKP, that has a low salt index as a non-chloride source of potassium. But in other situations where we have very good quality irrigation water with low chlorides, maybe surface water, there may be the opportunity to use water-soluble formulations that do contain some potassium chloride. Also thinking about this idea of low salt index and chloride content, this also influences seed and root safety, particularly as we're choosing water-soluble fertilizers or considering the use of water-soluble fertilizers for starter fertilizer applications. Solubility of the product per gallon of water varies widely across different water-soluble fertilizer types. We'll show an example of that in a minute, and this certainly has an effect on how concentrated a solution that you can make depending on the product that you choose. In many cases, we'll want it to be combining multiple nutrients into the application stream, whether that's a starter fertilizer, fertigation, or potentially foliar. So thinking about the compatibility of different water-soluble fertilizers or water-soluble fertilizers with liquid fertilizer sources becomes very important, especially as we consider the interaction of calcium and phosphorus. And then finally, water-soluble fertilizers, particularly NPK formulations, will be influenced by the nutrient analysis and balance that's needed for different application timings for individual crops. And what's most important to focus on in terms of total nutrients and nutrient balance, nutrient ratio, at those different times within the growing season. Here are a few examples of water-soluble fertilizers. These are ICL products, but this gives you an idea of the range of different options that are available within basic water-soluble fertilizers, or what we refer to as water-soluble straight fertilizers within ICL. And so these are the types of products that are going to supply typically 1 to 2 key nutrients, and are often used either directly applied to the crop, or they're combined in various fashions to produce a finished liquid formulation of solubilized water-soluble fertilizers, or combined into a finished dry NPK water-soluble fertilizer formulation. You'll recognize common fertilizers like MKP, monopotassium phosphate in the third line, water-soluble MAP or monoammonium phosphate, magnesium nitrate, potassium nitrate, calcium nitrate. These are all common fertilizers that are available from a wide range of manufacturers. There are also some unique products to ICL that you'll hear about throughout the presentation, like PEC acid, that it's a soluble acidic PK fertilizer with an analysis of 0,60,20. As we focus on this list of examples, you'll note that the first 3 products, PEC acid, high peak, and peak, are all water-soluble fertilizers that supply both phosphorus and potassium in different analyses. And so obviously this provides you different opportunities to combine these fertilizers with other water-soluble fertilizers or liquid fertilizers to create different finished analyses depending on the requirements of the crop or the farm. But there are other characteristics of these water-soluble fertilizers that illustrate the wide range of contrasting characteristics that are available within water-soluble fertilizers. And so what am I talking about? As we look at these 3 sources of phosphorus and potassium, they have different analyses. That's the first characteristic that varies. MKP, a widely available phosphorus and potassium fertilizer, has an analysis of 0,52,34. Nova PEC acid has additional phosphorus, so an analysis of 0,60,20, and then Nova High Peak has additional potassium with an analysis of 0,44,44. Along with the contrasting nutrient analyses, there are 2 other characteristics that vary across these 3 products that potentially influence how they're used. One is the pH of the solution. As we think about MKP, the product on the left, this is mildly acidic with a pH around 4.5 in solution. In contrast, Nova PEC acid is very acidic in solution. 1% solution of this product has a pH of 2.2, which allows or promotes excellent compatibility between phosphorus and the calcium when they're applied together. And then finally, for Nova High Peak, the product on the right, this has a pH in solution of around 6.8 or 7, so more of a neutral pH product. So these different pHs are potentially going to influence compatibility with other nutrients, but also as we think about foliar applications of these products, particularly MKP and High Peak, the pH can also influence how these nutrient products influence and interact with crop protection products that might be tank mixed along with the nutrition. The final characteristic that varies between these 3 sources of phosphorus and potassium fertilizer is the solubility. Especially if we contrast MKP, the product on the left, versus High Peak, the product on the far right, we have a difference in solubility of around 2 pounds per gallon for MKP versus a solubility for High Peak that's closer to 6 pounds per gallon. And this is going to affect how concentrated a solution that we can make. And also with a foliar application, you can influence how much nutrition can be applied often in a relatively limited volume of water that's applied to certain crops. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Christi, and she's going to elaborate more on this idea of the compatibility of nutrients in solution, and particularly the effect of reducing pH through the selection of acid-forming water-soluble fertilizers.
All right, thanks, Jason. So if we look at these pictures on the right-hand side and we think about our drip irrigation system, or if we're doing it through a pivot or any other means that we're doing it when we have our water that has a lot of calcium in it and magnesium, and we can have that hard water, then we can get some problems that will occur in our irrigation system. And then the one on the top left is showcasing, the wetting pattern that's going to happen as we get those where they're blocked up. So not only are we limiting our water, then when we're fertigating, we're limiting our nutrients that are going across the beds or getting good distribution for the crop uptake. So that's one piece to the puzzle of how interconnected that our fertigation and our irrigation are together, and dealing with our hard water and our high pH of our soils. So another aspect, as Jason mentioned, is the compatibility. So if you look on the bottom left at that with the beakers, you'll see that the one on the right is not mixing in solution versus the one on the left is. So the one on the left was the PEC acid that Jason mentioned, where it has the low pH and it actually can mix with different phosphorus sources, and it can mix with calcium. So those are some aspects that we think about for both the nutrient and the water use efficiency, and having the right product that we select. Okay, let's go to the next one, Jason. So another piece to the puzzle on the compatibility, this isn't everything together, obviously, it's not all products, but it gives you a cross section of an idea of thinking through some of the mixability or the compatibility. And everything in red would be a stop or non-compatible. So you see a lot of things that are related to calcium that are non-compatible. And then we also have some that are a caution, the test is required. What we're after is a lot more of the green, which means obviously a go with a stop and go sort of a thought process. So our PEC acid that Jason mentioned, you can see that it has a lot of green across the board, very compatible. So we're going to want to use a cross section of different products. We just have to keep in mind what they are and aren't compatible with. And then when we start mixing a bunch of things together with different water sources, we always want to do a jar test and make sure that it's not going to settle out. Okay, so another thing that we look at, and Jason, I'll have you go ahead and click one more time on this. There we go. So if we think about repeated fertigation of water-soluble fertilizers, we think, okay, it's an immediate, it's precise control that we can have with that, but it also can have a beneficial effect on the soil chemistry within the application zone. This is a trial that was done in Oregon with some of our high pH soils, and our pH low products that you can see here listed compared to the control. What we're after is we were fertigating, and we fertigated 9 different times throughout the season, and it was with micro sprinklers. So it's going along that zone for our orchard. And as we do that, you notice on the bar chart or the table that's on the left-hand side, you see the control versus the pH low. You look at the phosphorus and the potassium, and you can see that we have nearly doubled the levels of the phosphorus and potassium in the soil. If you look at the one on the right, we've also increased the iron content. So we definitely are helping out there. And you think about the application of the amount of fertilizer that we put on, we actually only put on 36 pounds per acre of P2O5, and the same for K2O. So that would normally, if we look at, it's always going to vary based on soils and different conditions, but it would normally only raise it 2 to 3 parts per million. So when we do the precise control of the fertigation, we actually are seeing that we can influence the soil characteristics, and we can have more uptake that could occur. This had been previously done in a lab with different soils. This one, we took it out with a real world setting in a commercial orchard, and saw some very positive benefits there. So again, highlighting that we want to look at precise control, and we can influence the soil chemistry, and we can have a lot better nutrient use efficiency that can come from those zones. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to ask David actually to cover the next couple of slides for us on some of the things that he has seen with dealing with some of our Western soils and our nutrients.
Good morning. Thank you for having me here and allowing me to participate in this discussion. As Christy just pointed out, several of these fertilizers that we're talking about have an acidification potential on our soils. And if the major difference between the West and the East sometimes is how alkaline or how acid soils are, and Western soils are more alkaline than acid. So if we can go in and dissolve limestone, because our waters are also high in bicarbonates and calcium, which then form a lime particles in the soil. If we can dissolve those with an acid fertilizer, it's beneficial. And the reason it's beneficial is it helps to what I call cleaning the soil. If we have an immediate exchange of sodium off of the soil colloid, we get better water percolation, better soil aeration, better leaching. And I found an old book, and if you can Google Lyotropic series and read quite a bit about it, but I found that the highest potential to exchange sodium and magnesium is through the use of soluble calcium with the two valence, +2 valence charges. Now you think of magnesium, it's got +2 valence also. The problem is the orbits on those magnesium ions are smaller than on calcium. And so calcium has the ability to push magnesium off the soil colloid and all the way down the line through ammonium, potassium, and sodium. And by doing so, you would think, well, okay, we've got all these soluble elements out here, maybe that's too much sodium. But once we do that, then we get leaching of those, and particularly of sodium, and cleans our soil. And a lot of the soils, particularly in California, on the west side of the Central Valley, are high in sodium, and a lot of the soils up the Sacramento Valley are high in magnesium. So we participated in quite a few calcium studies back in between 1999 and 2010, 30 to be exact, I think. And we found that the use of soluble calcium or the acidification of calcium in soil had great potential to open soils up and give benefit to the production, to our production, whether it was almonds or strawberries or pistachios or whatever crop we were talking about that had these soil problems. And so soluble calcium, whether we acidify the soil or we supply it, is the best element for the immediate exchange of sodium and magnesium off the soil colloid. Next slide, please. And so this is just a graphic example of what we're talking about. When you have it's just imagine two south poles of a magnet. The stronger the south poles of a magnet, as you push them together, the harder it is to push those two south poles together, or north poles, whichever way you want to look at it. So if you exchange off the single valent sodiums and potassiums and attach more divalent calciums to the soil, you will separate the soil and give yourself better aeration, larger pore space, better water percolation, better leaching of some of the salts in our soils. So that's a basic graphic to illustrate what we're talking about. Next slide. And Christy, I think you want to jump back in at this point.
Well, I actually would like to open it up for a discussion, I guess, as far as thinking through opportunities and challenges for water-soluble fertilizer use that you might see from your experience that you've had, David.
Oh, well, so in a different life, I formulated fertilizers, liquid fertilizers and dry fertilizers. And I also made urea sulfuric acid fertilizers. So I'm very familiar with fertilizer formulation. I think the beauty of water-soluble fertilizers is the precision in which you can make blends of these water solubles and get the results you want to get. Early development, you want some high phosphorus for root development, also high nitrogen as the plant starts to grow. And then you want to start changing your ratios to maybe a little higher phosphorus as we're trying to produce flower, and fruit. And then when we want to finish that fruit off or the plant off, we need potassium. And there's all kinds of stages in a crop's life where you want to change the ratios. And I think you have a lot of variability in working with water-soluble fertilizers. You know, when we make urea sulfuric blends, there's always some issues with the sulfuric acid. And I think it's a lot easier to handle water-soluble type fertilizers with these high phosphates, these acidifying aspects of them. And with our waters in California, particularly, and the West, not just California, Idaho and Washington and Oregon, they're high in calcium and bicarbonates. And so they have a tendency to do what you just showed in an earlier slide. We form precipitates. And as we go to more and more to drip irrigation, low volume irrigation, precipitates are not good because they clog the emitters and disrupt our water patterns in the soil. And the beauty of going to low volume irrigation, or the beauty of using water solubles, is that they're very compatible with low volume irrigation systems.
Okay, thanks, David. Jason, let's go to the next slide. And actually, I think Jason's gonna cover a few of these.
Yes, and thanks for that background, you know, Christy and David. For the remainder of the webinar, we're going to talk about some water-soluble fertilizer, you know, use case scenarios and examples. We will spend you know, quite a bit of time on fertigation and walking through some of the decisions made in designing a fertigation program, you know, using water-soluble fertilizers. We'll have an example primarily from peppers, but you know, touch on strawberries as well. But before we want to get to that, I also want to talk about a couple of different other uses for water-soluble fertilizers, namely starter fertilizer applications and foliar applications. You know, first of all, for starter fertilizers, and this can apply to specialty crops in the West, or perhaps even more so, row crops in the Midwest and other parts of the U.S. and North America. Often the conversation or decision-making process for starter fertilizers revolves around orthophosphates versus polyphosphates, and some examples of common liquid starter fertilizers include products like 1034O or ammonium polyphosphate, 918-9, 624-6, these types of products. And oftentimes, water-soluble fertilizers are left out of the discussion or not even considered as an option for starter fertilizers. And so one of the key learnings, or the point that I want to get across with this example, is that considering optimized water-soluble fertilizer sources can potentially provide greater phosphorus use efficiency in starter fertilizer applications. This is an example from Wisconsin, a trial in 2022 that was applied to corn. With grower standard practice for corn starter fertilizer applications in the Midwest can vary in terms of products, but liquid 1034O is a common and widely available option used as a starter fertilizer. Oftentimes the application rates of 1034O can be 3 to 5 gallons per acre. And if we think about 3 gallons per acre of 1034O in this example, that's nearly 12 pounds per acre of P2O5. In this example, these were in-furrow applications. We did have a positive starter fertilizer response from all of the treatments that we evaluated. For 1034O as an example, the response was around 4.5 bushels per acre. For the water-soluble fertilizer option that we were evaluating, we chose a product, an ICL product called Agrolution pH Low 114511. So we have that focus on early season phosphorus, which is what the crop needs at this particular point in the season, along with some nitrogen and some potassium as well. And the treatments that were evaluated applied either 6 pounds per acre of product solubilized in water, or 12 pounds per acre of product solubilized in water. And as we look at these two treatments, we had responses compared to the untreated control of 4.7 bushels per acre for the lower rate of Agrolution pH Low, and around 6.5 bushels per acre for the higher rate of Agrolution pH Low. And the thing that really stands out to me in this example is that even though we had similar responses compared to the control for these Agrolution pH Low water-soluble fertilizer treatments, compared to 1034-0, we were achieving those responses with significantly less total applied phosphorus per acre, 2.7 pounds of P2O5 per acre for the low rate of water-soluble fertilizer and 5.4 pounds of P2O5 per acre for the higher rate of water-soluble fertilizer. And I think, this kind of comes back to the, some of the other concepts that we introduced earlier with the potential benefits of, lowering the soil pH and the effect that can have, in terms of promoting compatibility in the tank, in the liquid tank, but also improving nutrient availability in the soil. Another application or example that I'd like to highlight is foliar application on apples. This was a trial in Michigan from 2022 where we were looking at a grower standard practice of MKP with an analysis of 0,50,33 versus ICL's Nova High Peak at an analysis of 0,44,44. Different rates, a low rate and a high rate for the high peak applications. And in total, applying 6 foliar applications, throughout the growing season. And the key, insight or learning here is that, foliar applications of water-soluble fertilizers, whether it's high peak or the other product that was included in this trial, is a way in which we can target essential nutrients, like phosphorus or maybe even more important in this example, potassium, to late season, fruit filling processes to improve, fruit size and fruit quality, potentially even fruit storability. And this occurs, even with the foundation of soil applied nutrition. In this particular trial, the trees, the orchard had a spring broadcast application of N, P, and K fertilizers as the foundation for the nutritional needs of the crop. And these water-soluble fertilizer foliar applications were being made late in the season to specifically target potassium to the developing fruit. And then the final application before we get into fertigation is another foliar example. This is on soybeans, another trial from Wisconsin, a very recent trial from this season. And the key learning or concept that we want to get across with this example is that optimizing the timing of application, or maybe even considering sequential applications, in other words, more than one application of a water-soluble fertilizer, are important for foliar response or foliar efficacy. In this particular trial, we were looking at two different products, one called Nova Pulse, which is a combination of phosphorus and potassium along with some micronutrients, including cobalt and molybdenum, zinc. This was applied early in the season, the B4, B6 stage. It was applied again at R1, R2, so when the flowering started to occur, and then a sequential application of that early season application followed by the reproductive stage application. And although each one-time application had a positive response compared to the control, where we had the greater response for that particular product of Nova Pulse was with that sequential application, or ensuring that that nutrition was available at various key stages of growth and development throughout the season for soybeans in this example. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it back to Christy and David, and we'll talk about fertigation and some of the aspects or considerations of crop nutrient design planning with examples of recent trials in California at David's farm.
Okay, thanks. I do notice that there are a few questions that are coming in the chat. I'll answer a couple of them that are specific for me before we go into some of all of the others. Specifically on the pear trial, asking about the P and the K in the tissue. We did evaluate the P and the K in the tissue. They didn't do it enough times to where we could pick it all up and it was statistically significant, but we did see some increases there. But the biggest thing that we saw was a large yield response that came. So we knew that the P and the K was being taken up into the plants and helping the trees overall because we got the yield response along with the soil. And then one of the other ones I'll take a little bit on, and David or Jason could go a little bit more, is solving the incompatibility in water-soluble fertilizers. That's part of why we're talking about it now, is just trying to understand the different formulations and, you know, which ones play nice and which ones don't, and the importance of jar testing so that we know it. But another thing that I have utilized quite a bit is just the solution is dilution a lot of times, and then it's not putting concentrated ones right next to each other. Sometimes we can avoid it if we will just separate it with some water in between. So those are a couple of ideas that I have and answers for some of your questions that have come so far. So if we start thinking about the fertigation program and what we're going to do with water solubles, obviously it's going to be different for every soil, every crop. We have to think about what the total nutrient uptake demand is for the whole season, and then we need to break it down, as David was suggesting, you know, for what do we need when, based on the growth. So do we put in a dry granular fertilizer as part of it, making sure that we take it into account? And then we create our fertigation plan to match our weekly demand, and we think about it for the season. And then we think about, you know, do we do fertigation only? Do we have environmental conditions that put us to where we should be doing a controlled release or a sustained release fertilizer? You know, what's the timing of our weather going to be? Do we need to have the water going on? You know, can we get it out, the nutrients, in a fertigation basis? So those are all some of the things that we have to consider as we're going along. And then foliar, as Jason showed, can influence the yield potential at the end, but are there other things that we can do as part of it? And don't forget that we can apply them with the different crop protection products in a beneficial way if we need to lower the pH, but we don't want to lower it too much. So it's a balancing act that we do as we design these programs. Okay, Jason. So, you know, we think about it, we're going to choose different products. These are just some that we can use for examples. You know, we can have some that are an all-purpose type that we use throughout the season, or we can have ones like our 11-45-11 that's got the 2% zinc that we're after early in the season, getting the phosphorus and the zinc, getting our rooting off and going. Or do we need later in the season, you know, as Jason was talking, that we need the potassium, then we can move up to like an agrolution pH low 631-31. And then as we're thinking about the fruit set and what we would want to do in the reproduction, then we start needing to have our potassium high, but we start thinking about our calcium and our magnesium so we can have good fruit quality and we'd have less disease potential that would come on that front. Okay, next, Jason. So we can think about the nitrogen to potassium ratio, the nitrogen to sulfur ratio. If we can get those in balance with each other and where they need to be, then we're going to get better nutrient use efficiency. And if we have a crop like corn that requires a huge amount of potassium, you know, for its grand growth phase, then we have to have thought ahead for making sure that we can maximize and get that potassium available so that our nitrogen can be utilized in a good manner. The same with the sulfur. We need the two together. We need that sulfur for the amino acids and looking at the whole piece to the puzzle. We want to have better nutrient use efficiency overall. We want to have synergies because if we're making sure that we have enough photosynthesis going on, enough carbohydrates that are stored, enough energy, then we have our better yield potential. And we want more uptake, and we don't want the precipitates to form or the tying up in the soil that would happen. So those are all things that we need to keep in mind as we balance our fertilizer in our soil. Okay. So this is an example of starting to think through a strawberry fertility program and what you would do. And so we would start off for this one, our base was an Agriform strawberry mix that was a controlled release fertilizer. so that we could be mitigating the risk of not being able to get in there, but we'd have a good control of the nutrients and release that's going to be based on what the nutrients need and as our temperatures change. And then we also could apply, at that same time, we could apply a product like a granular polysulfate that has a sustained release of calcium, potassium, magnesium, and sulfur. And then we pair it with the in-season fertigation that you can see there, where we'd start early on with our higher phosphorus and zinc. Then we go to a more balanced approach. Then we add in our calcium and magnesium. And then we finish off with our lower nitrogen and our higher potassium. Okay, let's go to the next. So we think about peppers and the growth of all of our crops are going to be a little different as we have the demands that come in. But you think about a pepper crop early on, we're not going to have huge demands. But then very quickly we can need the nitrogen that is going to be there for us. And we got to have the phosphorus as we're starting off and getting those roots up and going. But then we really need to make sure that we have the potassium so that we can be able to be moving the water and the nutrients through the system. We can have the fruit set and the fruit size, the carbohydrates that are necessary so that we can finish the development. And we need to make sure that we have adequate calcium and magnesium to finish off our fruit and have a good quality going into storage. Okay. So then, like we did for the strawberries, this is looking through trying to decide on an example of what we would do and think about granular polysulfate as a dry fertilizer as our base, and then putting in fertigation. And we started off with our high phosphorus and zinc. We moved to more of a balanced approach on our fertigation with the 20-19-20. And then we finished off with the 15-6-27 and the calcium, and we're supplementing it with a UN32 to get the appropriate nitrogen that we would need. Okay. So then if we look at this trial and we look at the summary of what we did, this is a trial that David and I worked on together. David conducted it in California, and him and I looked at putting it together and evaluating it. And so we were trying to decide, well, what should we do? And so we started with the grower standard, trying to understand what it was there. And then we start thinking, what else can we do to lower the fertigation? Think about the cost. And then we start thinking, okay, now we can add in the granular polysulfate as a piece to the puzzle. And then the last one that you see is there with the full fertigation and what we were doing, trying to boost what we could do with our potassium. Again, thinking about our nitrogen to potassium ratio as we change some of these. What are our effects on these particular soils? The nitrogen to sulfur, the nitrogen to potassium ratio that we talked about earlier, and the calcium to magnesium ratios, thinking about those with these fertilizers as well. Okay, Jason. Okay, so as we started looking through with some of the yields that came along with that, we have where we can see the total tons per acre on the far left that was for the processing yield. And then the second column over is the marketable weight of the pepper. And you see the treatment 3 and 4, where we were adding those in with a granular polysulfate, as well as treatment 2 with a low fertigation. We were able to increase the size of the peppers on an individual basis. And then in addition to that, we were able to increase the jumbos and the large peppers above what the grower standard was. So we were pushing the envelope there, because normally when we look at the pricing that a grower is going to receive, the larger peppers are going to get a better price. Okay. So then we look at the dollar returns that come, and we think about those same 5 fertilizer treatments from a fresh market freight on board dollars per acre is your first column there. And our fresh market yield, what we were able to get. And then you look at the yield change and you see that the polysulfate was 11 to 12% increase above what it was previously. And the other piece of the puzzle is just looking at, you know, the cost, the nutrient use efficiency as we think through all of these and trying to find the right piece to the puzzle. So I'm going to pause a moment for this slide or the previous slide and let Jason or David, if there's additional thoughts that you guys would like to do on either of these 2 slides.
Well, I'd like to point out that quite often you'll see research, particularly in production research, and you don't see significant differences, or they're not presented. And we got 3-way splits in significance on this trial, which impressed me, because quite often you don't get that. And the other thing is even though we did not look at the significance of the financial return, that was very significant. Now, those of you in the Midwest and in some other growing regions are going to look at those gross numbers per acre. You got to realize that there's a lot of expense in growing these fresh market peppers. They're on poles, they're strung up, they take special equipment to harvest them, to spray them, to manage them, and land costs and rent costs in California are a lot different than the Midwest. So don't be too shocked by those numbers, but I get that question all the time, but that's the reality of farming in California. You can make good money at times, but you can also spend a lot of money to get to that point. But I was particularly impressed with treatments 3 and 4 and how well they worked out.
So if we look at, I guess David's kind of highlighted treatments 3 and 4, but for me, you know, it was good as far as the processing side, and then the fresh market, we were able to increase those yields and the returns that came. The low fertigation for me is trying to understand the costs and think about what we can do there. You know, we were able to get larger peppers, but then we had some lower yields and returns a little bit. So really, though, it was quite good, and we just maybe didn't have enough potassium later in the season, and we didn't have enough calcium that would come into play. So I think that's where it brings into account that dry granular polysulfate. It had a sustained release of the potassium, and then it had the calcium, the magnesium, the sulfur, and it was slow release, so similar to what we would have with an agriform. It's a natural mineral, so that combination of fertigation with the dry could be a really good option to consider for maximizing the nutrient use efficiency along with economics and production.
Okay, thank you, Christy. Thank you, David. So to summarize our presentation this morning, we started out you know, identifying some of the questions or key considerations for using water-soluble fertilizers. And you know, our recommendation would be to choose the best products for the application type, whether that's fertigation, foliar use, or other soil applied applications like starter fertilizers, as well as you can consider the the soil characteristics as well as the source water characteristics, whether that's irrigation water or even the water that you put into the spray tank or the starter fertilizer tank. Choosing the best products maximizes nutrient use efficiency through effects like reducing pH potentially, as well as considering formulation characteristics. And for foliar products, we touch to a great deal or a great extent on the formulation characteristics or benefits of water solubles designed or positioned specifically for foliar applications. But additional additives like surfactants and biostimulants, amino acids, those types of additives to improve foliar uptake are often an advantage. The second consideration is to ensure compatibility. between nutrient sources prior to blending and application. We can't stress this, enough that, doing your own jar test or your own compatibility test, ahead of time with the nutrient sources that you're going to use, whether those are water solubles or liquids, some combination of the two, along with the source water that you are intending to use, is very important to catch any concerns or mistakes ahead of time before we have a costly negative impact on an irrigation system or any other type of application system. Christi highlighted, through the strawberry example as well as the pepper example, that considering alternative sources of nutrition besides water-soluble fertilizers as part of the overall fertility program, is important. With granular fertilizers, whether those are controlled release fertilizers or mineral fertilizers, those are going to have different release characteristics that can be advantageous for different crops and different production scenarios. And it's also important to consider that as the weather changes or the weather is more volatile, especially in a fertigated system, if we don't need to irrigate due to high rainfall, having those soil applied sources of nutrition can be an important risk management approach. And then finally, you have a plan. You like the examples that Christi and David provided for the strawberries and the peppers, but also use in-season diagnostic tools like tissue testing or soil testing to refine the plan as the crop and the season evolves. And that's part of the beauty of water-soluble fertilizers, is that even though you have that plan, you do have the ability as the season progresses to make adjustments, choose different products, combine nutrient sources in different ways to affect the outcome for maximum productivity and maximum return on investment to your operation.
So I guess, Jason, along with that, one of the things that I was going to say is, when we think about the low fertigation option on the peppers, if I could have looked at, another fertilizer that I could put into that, thinking about a better for the future, you always want to learn for the next go round, is, I needed to put a little bit more potassium in with that one. So picking and choosing different water soluble fertilizers as you try different ones, and then you can piecemeal the ones together that work really well for you. So being familiar with all the different products that are out there, testing them out ahead of time, understanding what you have as tools in the toolbox is important.
Yeah. Great observation, Christi. Thank you. So as we wrap up, if you have any questions or would like follow up on any your topics that we've discussed here this morning, feel free to contact Christi and I at the email address shown on the screen. We'll also have a few minutes for questions. So Marie, if you have a few questions you'd like to present to us or ask, we can cover those. And if we don't get to all of them this morning, we'll certainly try to follow up with everyone the best we can. So thank you.
Yeah, there are a number of questions. Thanks for jumping in and answering them kind of on the fly as they came up. So let's see, let's start at the top of the list here. And forgive me if you've touched on this some, but perhaps there's other details you can add. So one of the questions is about how these different water-soluble fertilizers might interact with the soil salinity or microbiome. This is a question specific to phosphate solubilizing bacteria. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and I think part of the potential interaction or similarity is that especially with the use of acids, whether it's the injection of liquid acids like phosphoric acid or sulfuric acid or the PEC acid product we talked about throughout this presentation, we're trying to improve the solubility of nutrients in the soil through that reduction in pH. And similarly, phosphorus solubilizing bacteria are excreting organic acids to do a similar type of thing. And it's not something specifically that we've looked at, the interaction of water soluble fertilizers and soil health. But one of the areas of innovation that I see with water soluble fertilizers going forward is greater influence or greater emphasis rather on adding biologicals to water soluble fertilizers, biostimulants, humic acids, fulvic acids. I mean, these are already commonly used in many cropping systems, but that innovation in water soluble fertilizers will be less about the essential nutrients. Those aren't going to change over time, but how we can further enhance the availability of those essential nutrients using practices rooted in biology and trying to optimize soil health that's already existing in the soil, or trying to enhance soil health through those additives that we apply to the crop.
That question's not hard to answer, and in the future that might be something you want to look into, because there are labs that look at soil health and the biome and what's upcharged, what's downcharged, negative bacteria, positive bacteria, negative fungi, positive fungi. So that's a good question, something to look into.
Yeah, another question that came in that's a little bit, well, a couple questions actually that are related to that is like interactions with the soil cation exchange space. So there's questions about releasing of potassium, or just interactions with calcium, magnesium, and changing that composition. Kind of like theoretically like opening up the soil for that other kind of release.
Yeah, I can answer that. So those 29 to 30 trials that I did between 1999 and 2010, I consolidated that into a chart. You don't have it before you, but I'm looking at it right now. And in that case, without talking about rates or anything, we saw 50% increase on average at the end of the season. Well, you got. I don't
I'm
think.
prompting you to share it if you wish.
Yeah,
that's easy.
let me just give you some details on it. But we saw a 50% increase in soluble calcium. We saw a 26% increase in soluble magnesium. We saw a 15% increase in soluble potassium, and we saw a 6% increase in soluble sodium. Now, you might think about that soluble sodium as being negative, but the point is we made them available. They were knocked off the soil colloid, and they could be either taken out or leached out of the system. And so we also saw a significant decrease in chlorides, almost 100% decrease in chlorides. And that was a very positive effect, because not only do we have some high sodium waters, we also have some high saline waters in California. In fact, that's the issue I deal with more than anything.
Yeah, so another question that came in while you're discussing that is how any guidance on balancing that calcium to potassium ratio, is particularly for different crops, different crop growth stages. They reach fruiting, etc. Is there a way that you can use, kind of cater your fertigation schedule to balance that a little bit more effectively?
Well, one of the things we found in this trial these trials I'm talking about, was that we would alternate our potassium applications with calcium applications, and these were generally done on cannery tomatoes, almonds, pistachios, citrus, mostly in the San Joaquin Valley. And we did exactly that. We'd make an application, and 2 weeks later, we'd make a potassium application, and 2 weeks later, we'd make a calcium application. And we saw that alternating them was probably better than putting them iron together. We'd get the potassium iron, it'd tie up on the soil a little bit, then we'd add calcium, and we'd knock that off. And that's where we saw the best results.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments on that, Christy, Jason?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. So Jason, the question came in when you were talking about the corn example, and they were curious to understand more about how you'd explain that similar performance of the products. And then their follow-up question was, at a pH above 7, would the low rate of starter have much influence on nutrient uptake? And maybe if so, for how long?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. I could probably spend another hour talking about this particular topic, because it's something I think about a lot and have a lot of questions on. But the first thing I would start with is, for corn starter fertilizer, application rates, whether it's 10-34-0 or other, liquid products, farmers are often using, 3 to 5 gallons of product per acre. And, I wonder sometimes, why did we as an industry, settle on, kind of a blanket recommendation of 5 gallons per acre of starter fertilizer? What research was that based on? Is it based on 1034-0 and how that was developed several decades ago. I really haven't been able to find an answer to that. And so I suspect that we may in fact be applying more phosphorus than what we need to optimize the starter response with the products that we've had available to us. Specifically thinking about that that trial, one thing that we maybe didn't elaborate on enough was that the Agrolution pH low water soluble fertilizers that we've used as examples contain pec acid, so they have that acidification effect. And so when I think about water used for starter fertilizer applications, particularly in that example where we're using the water soluble fertilizer, in the Midwest, hard water is common. Hard water contains calcium, so through that acidification, we're ensuring that that phosphorus is as available as it can be to the crop. And also in that particular example, the pH was around 7. And so as the pH goes up, higher soil pHs, I would expect that the response to pec acid or Agrolution pH low as a starter fertilizer should actually become greater or more consistent. One of the things I've wondered about is as we go into lower pH soils, below 7, is that acidification actually going to have any benefit? And through our trials across the eastern U.S. and southeast U.S. this year, we found that actually we still have that same response, or maybe even a greater response compared to 1034-0 by using Agrolution pH low at lower rates of phosphorus applied, not only in corn, but we're also seeing it in soybeans and potatoes as well. So we'll be starting a project relatively soon to laboratory project to understand more about the soil chemistry interaction of using these acidifying water soluble fertilizers for starter fertilizer application, but also in combination with fulvic acids, because we've seen some interesting interactions and responses there. And just the last comment on that topic is, if anyone's planning to attend the American Society of Agronomy meetings next week in St. Louis, I'll have another presentation on this particular topic on Monday at 9:30 Central Time. So if you're around in St. Louis, make sure to stop in for that.
Excellent. Yeah, I was actually kind of thinking the same thing, that there's both, if you want to follow up for more information, you've got the contact information on this slide. You can also reach out to me at the education address, or to Lacey through the registration if you need our speaker contact information. So we have reached the top of the hour. I apologize if we didn't get to your question. There were a number of questions that came in that I related, but hopefully we've touched on that to some degree. Again, reach out to ICL Group and to David Holden if you have some follow-up questions yet. And all I'll say then in conclusion is thank you everyone for attending. And also there's a 4-question, very brief survey that will pop up when you leave the webinar. I ask that you please just give us some indication of what you'd like to hear about next, thinking about content and CEU's availability for 2024, and that will help us shape what we make available to you. And so I just ask that you please respond to that survey, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day. Enjoy your Monday. And thank you, everybody. Goodbye.